speak to make a contribution on this important bill before the House, the Modern Slavery Bill of 2018, and to support amendments moved by a member for Hotham in this regard. The idea that slavery is some kind of shameful artefact from our deep historical past of a less civilised times, perhaps, is something that is often, very prevalent in popular imagination. That slavery is something that has been left behind us from long ago. But the reality, of course, Deputy Speaker, is that there are now more slaves today than at any other time in human history. That is a very sobering thought. It is estimated that there are 45.8 million people who are living in slavery or slave-like conditions around the world. And our region, Deputy Speaker, is amongst the worst. That is why this parliament, it is critical that this parliament steps up to show a leadership role in this regard, because modern slavery, as I said, is so prevalent in our region. It is estimated that 2/3 of people living in the Asia-Pacific are impacted. That is, a terrifying thought. And according to the Global Slavery Index of 2018, an estimated 15,000 are right here in Australia. So this is not something that belongs to other foreign lands. This is not someone else's problem. We have a very deep, profound issue in our own nation that needs to be addressed. It has spread its exploitative tentacles throughout our society. The person who cares for your children, who cleans your office, who makes your clothes or serves your food, they could all be victims of modern slavery, hidden but in plain sight. And that is indeed a point that was made again and again during the parliamentary inquiry, which I was very privileged to be a part of. Places like the UK, France, California and the EU have already introduced legislation to protect people from these appalling practices, and it's now time for us in Australia to take strong action ourselves. The shocking truth is that Australia currently has no formal mechanism that directly targets modern slavery in business operations or supply chains, and we cannot go on in that way. This is why Labor has a modern slavery policy, which includes supply chain reporting requirements and penalties for non-compliance. That, Deputy Speaker, is an essential part of any successful Modern Slavery Act. And that is an issue I will return to, but it is something that bothers me and my colleagues on this side of the House enormously, the lack of penalties for breaches in the current legislation. If we have learned anything from the UK model, which was, much of this was based on, we should have been very live to the fact that the absence of penalties is profoundly problematic. On this side of the House, we are, as I said, very committed to forcing the business community to investigate risk in their supply chains and ensure another very critical component, again, that is sadly lacking in this bill, is the establishment of an Australian independent anti-slavery commissioner. Again, I'll come to some points as to why that is so essential, but the fact there are two gaping holes in this legislation. One is the lack of penalties and the lack of an independent anti-slavery commissioner. Very problematic components of this bill. It will take a Labor government to, in fact, improve this bill. And that will exactly be our intentions should we get to serve on the government benches. but it's, you know, the bill before the House today, I don't wish to take away from the government, is an important first step. It's just not going far enough. But I think that the reasons why you would insist upon an independent anti-slavery commissioner, for example, is that the business engagement unit that the government proposes in this legislation really is just going to have a very strong focus on the business community and assistance that can be provided there, whereas the role of an independent anti-slavery commissioner is a much broader role than just liaising with the business community. We would regard that commissioner as having very important functions to support victims of these modern slavery practices, and to work with, the commissioner's role will be very much to work with civil society to help prevent and detect slavery as it occurs in Australia. And that's important because there are practices. I see my colleague, the member for Lingiari, here in the chamber. He and I have taken evidence in another unrelated inquiry that exposes practices that should absolutely come under the umbrella of this Modern Slavery Act, but they will not. They will not. And without an independent commissioner for those people to go to have some pathway in which to talk about the shocking arrangements that are taking place for some Indigenous artists in Australia who are being asked to practice in a manner that by any measure would be regarded as extremely exploitative, if not part of what we would now deem to be modern-day slavery. This is an example, without going into detail of those cases, but where people are either against their will or clearly not making, not with informed consent, being asked to participate in a work situation that is nothing short of a sweatshop in order to paint their way out of debt. Right here in our country today. This legislation, as it currently is drafted, will not help those people. And so that is an example of why we need to move these amendments, why I'm here strongly supporting the amendments moved by Labor, because this bill needs to be improved, and it should be improved. I would love the government to accept the amendments, and perhaps this is an opportunity for them to have a change of heart and think, this is a good first step, but we can make this bill better. Let's work with Labor to do that. I would love to hear the minister come back in and put that to the House, because in its current form the bill is disappointing. And I think that there was a lot of concern about responses and reactions from the sort of big business community towards these this new kind of reporting regimes, and I take that on board. But we should be providing the necessary, supports there for businesses to be able to report in open, transparent ways around the way they do business, and indeed the way they do business across their entire supply chains. Yes, let's help guide and nurture business through those new reporting regimes, but let's also be very explicit in the provision of support and backing for people who find themselves, firmly embedded in modern slavery practices, both here in Australia and abroad. The absence of penalties, as I said, Deputy Speaker, really should have been dealt with before this legislation came to this House. The need for penalties has been absolutely one of the key lessons we should learn from the UK experience. But we've squibbed it. The government has squibbed it. And I would argue that the absence of the penalties in this legislation means that in the 3 years since the Act's enactment, back in the UK, this was the lessons that we learnt, that only half of the 9,000 to 11,000 organisations that the UK government estimated are required to report have actually produced a slavery and human trafficking statement. So, you know, you're getting about a 50% kind of compliance when you have no capacity to enforce. You know, there are no penalties in place for people to, if they don't comply. You've got no mechanisms there to ensure that you reach your target of, you know, you're aiming for 100% compliance here, but with absolutely no, you know, in the absence of these penalties, you're getting approximately 50% of people even being prepared to undertake the reporting process, which they are completely obliged to do. But without the penalties, that's what happens. So I would predict that that's exactly what you would see in Australia as well. That really, in my view, is just going, you know, it's squibbing the issue. It's going soft in the area of human rights, which should be, you know, given the intent of this bill, should be front and centre of our reckoning, and ensuring that people's human rights are being observed, they're being protected, they're being nurtured. You know, and that's why Labor has moved the amendments to introduce penalties to ensure that this legislation's got the teeth it needs to do its job, frankly. As I said earlier, I sat on the committee that did a lot of the work examining what a Modern Slavery Act might look like, and we heard from a lot of stakeholders giving evidence during that period. And I have to say the vast majority of people who gave evidence in that inquiry all called for strong enforcement compliance mechanisms. They were very much in favour of penalties if people weren't complying and meeting their obligations too. Oxfam, for example, told the committee that without these penalties in place, there's real risk that companies will not report under the Act, and this would seriously undermine the effectiveness of the Act and the goal to help eliminate modern slavery in supply chains. That kind of evidence was repeated time and time again. The Ethnics Community Council of Victoria, you know, made similar observations there, and argued that indeed the competition for funding and support alone won't give profit-driven business the incentive that they would need in a competitive market to investigate and disclose their supply chain. So real concerns about the capacity for this legislation to you know, really live up to expectations. I think that the government have, you know, very real expectations here, but they think everybody's going to play nice and without you know, penalties in place, that they will get everybody just on board doing the right thing. But history would suggest otherwise, and indeed the experience in the UK is a very, very clear demonstration of why you need those penalties in place. And as I said, the need for a independent commissioner, anti-slavery commissioner, is also a lesson we should have learnt from others, because victims of slavery in Australia absolutely deserve more than just a business engagement unit. That is not good enough. They deserve somebody who can monitor and scrutinise progress, work with victims, civil society and international organisations to prevent, detect and respond to slavery. That's what Labor proposes, someone that's independent, who can stand up for human rights violations in this country and give voice to the voiceless. If a Modern Slavery Act cannot do that, then it fails its first test. That is why I stand to support Labor's amendments and strongly urge the government to support them as well.
The member. The question.